Well, I'm super excited to say this is our 4th anniversary of the London Power BI user group. May is always a special month for London Power BI user group. And many of you who have been attending, you all know, we always get Chris Webb to speak at our May user group. So he's back here to share his knowledge and also share our happiness of the whole thing of the Power BI user group. So welcome back to Chris. Thank you again for.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, coming back to us to speak at our user group every May. Yeah, really thank you. And so for people who, in case if you don't know who's Chris has been MVP for many years, and at the moment he's a member of Power BI CAT team, the awesome team. And this is something I stole from his slides when we were testing. He's a serious Power Query fan.
I am indeed a serious Power Query fan. In fact, I was going to say that on my next slide. You've kind of stolen my thunder.
Exactly, I stole it from your slides. When I saw that, I was like, that's nice. Sorry, you can still have your thunder. And today, Chris is going to talk about one of the really important topic of the Power Query. And also, I could probably say, because at the moment I'm struggling with this. So also, I'm sure everyone come across of this Power Query privacy settings. So Chris Webb is going to do the deep dive of Power Query privacy settings and everything around it. So it's all stage is yours, well, there, whatever it is, Chris.
All right.
I'm gonna mute myself.
Cool. Hopefully you can see my screen. If you stop seeing my screen, by all means unmute yourself and tell me that I'm presenting something you can't see. So yes, data privacy deep dive. This is a bit of an anticlimax, this slide now, because I was going to announce myself as the serious Power Query M fan, and you've already said that. But there are my, there's my Twitter handle, there's my blog. This is who I am. I work for Microsoft. There we go. So if you've ever read my blog, you probably know that I sometimes like to blog and go into detail about obscure topics that maybe aren't the most popular topics in the world. Maybe I like the kind of the really obscure, technically detailed stuff. And I would say this presentation in particular is a great example of maybe an obscure technical topic, but one which is definitely close to my heart. So before I start, what I want to do is do a sales job. I want to try and justify why you need to devote an hour of your time to listening to me about Power Query data privacy settings, rather than something a bit more, visual and crowd pleasing, like cool types of dashboards and stuff like that. So the question I've got is, have you ever seen these errors? These are the Formula Firewall errors I've got here. There are actually two of them, two different ones, and they are errors that generally strike fear into the heart of every Power Query developer, every Power BI developer. Because when you see these errors, you wonder, what have I done? What can I do to get rid of them? And you might Google, you'll see lots of blog posts. I myself have written about 10 different blog posts about this topic. Some of the blog posts out there are misleading or wrong or slightly incomplete. I would say that I don't have a proper full understanding of everything in this area either, but at least all my blog posts are right. So I would say if you've ever seen these errors, or if in the future as a more advanced Power BI developer than you are today, you do see these errors, what I'm going to tell you in this presentation is why they're there, why they're important, and how you can get around them. So that's my first part of my sales job. This stuff is important because you're going to run into these errors at some point. The second part of my sales job is, well, do I need to care about this? There's an easy way to make these errors disappear, as I'll show you in a moment. Why don't I just take that easy option? Well, the easy option comes with some risks. Today, we're all very aware of threats about leaking sensitive data. If we do something like that, if we let our company's most sensitive data leak out onto the internet, give it to somebody else, we could lose our job. We could be breaking the law. We could end up with headlines like this, where people are worried about Power Query functionality in Excel and how it and the kind of risks it presents. So if you're not worried about seeing those errors that I showed on the previous slide, what you should be worried about with this topic of data privacy is losing your job, breaking the law, or generally doing something that's going to professionally embarrass yourself. So there are two threats, two sticks there to beat you with, and so hopefully that will be enough to keep you interested for the next 55 minutes or so. So what are we going to talk about? Data privacy is a property of data sources in Power Query. Data privacy is all about controlling how data flows from one data source to another. So the way I'm going to structure this presentation is first talk about what data sources are, how the Power Query engine inside Power BI and Excel identifies data sources. Then we'll look at the data privacy settings in Power BI. And then we'll look at query folding briefly to explain what it is. And then we'll be able to look at those two error messages that I showed you to explain why they occur, how you can get rid of them, and what they mean, basically. Then we'll have a look at the end on some issues with data privacy in the Power BI service, looking at performance issues, looking at how data flows deal with data privacy issues, and so on. I won't be taking questions during the presentation, but if you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. I think Prathi and James will be answering some of them as we go along, but I'm going to be able to stick around after 2 o'clock to be able to answer any questions you've got. The problem with this presentation is that it involves quite a lot of thought and structure, so I have to do a lot of build-up. All right, first of all, as I said, data privacy and data privacy settings are something that are associated with data sources in Power Query. And pretty much everything I say here will apply to Power Query inside Power BI and Power Query inside Excel. All my demos, though, are going to be done in Power BI. So if you think about Power Query connects to data sources, it transforms the data, and it outputs that data into your data set inside Power BI. Now, what is a data source? A data source in Power Query is identified by two things, its kind and its path. The kind tells you what type of data source you're connecting to. Is it SQL Server or is it Excel? Is it a text file? Is it a web service? That's the kind. The path tells you the specific thing you're connecting to. So if you're connecting to SQL Server, you will be connecting to, for example, a database called AdventureWorks on a server called localhost. If you're connecting to a file, it will be the path of the file. So every single data source is identified by those two things. And if you go to the Power Query editor in Power BI Desktop, when you're developing your Power Query queries, you'll be able to see all of the data sources detected in a Power BI file, except when you have something called dynamic data sources. So some data sources have their connection information, that path information that I talked about, generated dynamically. So for example, you might be connecting to a web service and using some code to generate the URL of the web service that you're connecting to. You might be connecting to a text file and be using some M code to be able to generate the path of the file you're connecting to. That's what I mean by a dynamic data source. Now, the Power Query engine can handle dynamic data sources, but with some limitations. First of all, when you've got dynamic data sources, this is generally an opportunity. This is generally a scenario where you will have trouble refreshing your data set anyway in the Power BI service because of how some other checks the Power BI service that Power Query and Power BI Desktop doesn't do. But from the point of view of what we're talking about here, if you've got a dynamic data source, this is a data source that Power BI doesn't know about before the query runs, and it could be something different every time the query runs. Now, if data privacy settings are a property of a data source, and you need to specifically set these data privacy settings for a data source, how can you do that when you've got a dynamic data source? The answer is you can't. So this could cause problems. Let's switch over to Power BI Desktop and have a look and see what I mean by this. So here's the Power Query editor. I've got all of my demos already set up here. If you want to see the data sources used in the Power Query editor, you can go up here to the data source settings dialog, click on it, and you've got two radio buttons here. By default, you'll see data sources in the current file, and this will give you a list of all of the data sources detected in the current file. Global permissions will give you a list of all of the data sources that have been ever used in Power Query on your desktop machine, at least since you've cleared everything. And if you click on a data source, like one of these web services you've got here, you can see that we can set the credentials, and we've got a privacy level set here. We'll talk about that in a moment. But notice this error message that I've got here. Whenever dynamic data sources are detected, you will see that it's telling you that some data sources may not be listed because of hand-authored queries. If you ever see this error, this is where you need to start getting worried, because, as I said, it might mean that your data set doesn't refresh in the service. But certainly from the point of view of data privacy, you're not going to be able to set a data privacy setting for this data source because it's not listed here. So first thing, try to avoid dynamic data sources if you can. There are some things that you can do. I don't want to get too much off topic, but if we have a look at a bit of M code I've got here to call a web service, you can see that I'm using web.contents to call a web service. This is an example of a non-dynamic data source where I'm just calling the web service and hard coding a parameter. This is a good example of a dynamic data source where I'm passing search term as text into this function and I'm appending it to the URL, thus making it a dynamic data source. But there are also some situations where we can bend the rules. If you use the query option here, this is a way of kind of bypassing the dynamic nature of a web service by saying, we're going to call this web service, but then we'll just add this query parameter onto the end here. So, dynamic data sources are not always completely dynamic. But let's carry on. Let's talk about data privacy. So, data privacy settings control, as I said, how data can travel from one data source to another when you're running queries in Power Query, in Power BI, or in Excel. Now, these data privacy settings are properties of a data source, and they aren't set automatically for you. You have to set them specifically. And as I said, you can change them in that data source settings dialog. You may also find that when you're running a query, you will be prompted to set these data privacy checks as well. Now, by default, the data privacy checks that I'm going to talk about are on. You can control this a little bit. So if we go back to Power BI Desktop, there are some settings in Power BI Desktop that can control whether data privacy checks are turned on or not. So if you go to the options dialog, you'll see that under global and current file, there are both under both there are privacy tabs. So under global, you've got how Power BI Desktop always applies data privacy checks. There are three options here. First of all, and the default that's set is always combine data according to your privacy level settings for each source. This is the default. This always applies data privacy checks. Personally, I would say you should leave that as the option. The second option you've got, which is the option I've got selected here, allows you to turn data privacy checks off for certain workbook, for certain PBIX files. So with this option selected, you can go down to current file privacy, and you can say for this file, I will either apply data privacy checks or I will not. So with the way things are set up here for this PBIX file, data privacy checks will still be applied, but I can turn them off for other Power BI files. And then finally, if I go back to the privacy option under global, I've got the option to always ignore privacy level settings, which completely turns off data privacy checks. Now, when you're Googling for answers the first time you see one of those formula firewall errors, it's highly likely that you will see somebody suggesting or mentioning at least the fact that you can ignore data privacy checks. I would say you should never, ever ignore data privacy checks because it is going to be dangerous. It's dangerous because you'll find that the problem may only go away temporarily and comes back when you publish to the Power BI service. So it's not really a fix at all. And secondly, this is where we're in kind of losing your job territory. So as I'll explain in a minute, there are going to be a lot of dangers with private data leaking out. So never ever do this ever. All right, let's move on and understand a little bit more about what these data privacy checks mean and what they represent. So we know that data privacy checks are important. We know that data sources have some data privacy level associated with them. In more detail, every data source has one of 4 privacy levels associated with it: private, organizational, public, and none. And if we go back to the Power Query editor up here, and we go to the data source settings dialog, and I choose, for example, my connection up to SQL Server, I can go to edit permissions, and this is where I've got this drop down box that tells me what data privacy level I've got set at the moment. So the next question is, what on earth do all of these things mean? So I'm going to give you the theory first. Once we've got the theory out of the way, I will do some demos to explain what all of this really actually represents. So as I said, data privacy checks control how data can pass from one data source to another. And the rules are data from private data sources can never be sent to any other data source. So if you mark a data source as private, you are saying this is really important data. I never ever want it to leak anywhere outside the data source. Data from organizational data sources, on the other hand, can be sent to other organizational data sources. So you could say that you're okay with data going from one data source to another if it stays within your company or your organization. If so, then you can set your data privacy level for a data source to organizational. And then finally, you've got the rule that says data from public data sources can go anywhere. It can go to any other data source. You're not worried about privacy, just let things happen. So those are the three things you've got to bear in mind. Private can't go anywhere. Public can go anywhere. Organizational data can only go to other organizational data sources. There is a fourth option called none, and none just means that no privacy level has been set yet. If you do use the setting of none, you may find that when you run your query, you will get a prompt to choose another privacy level. In a slightly confusing way, you might find that even when you've got a data source set to none, that data source may inherit from a more general data source. So what do I mean by this? Let's go back up to here. Consider these two data sources. This is a UK government open data API that I use in demos a lot. I use it because it doesn't need any authentication and it just works. But this is not really an endpoint. This is just the root of the URL. This is a specific endpoint that allows me to search the UK open data repository for particular pieces of open data. So you can see that this URL appears at the beginning of this URL. If I set this, the data privacy level for this endpoint to be none, if I've set this to public, then this, because this is a subset of this is the root of this endpoint, then this endpoint can inherit its data privacy level from here. And the same can happen with text files. So I can have data privacy set on perhaps my C drive. If I did that, then even if these two data sources here had no data privacy level set, then they would inherit their data privacy level from that data privacy setting for the C drive that I'd set. So those are the rules. Now, the next question you're going to ask is, when does data ever pass from one data source to another? Surely that never happens, because surely in Power BI, you're connecting to data sources and you're bringing it into the data set. You're not passing data from one data source to another. So why is this even relevant? Well, this brings us on to the next question of query folding. So query folding is why data can pass from one data source to another while the data is being loaded into Power BI. Now, query folding is an optimization that the Power Query engine does. And basically, it means that when you're running a query in the Power Query editor, rather than loading the raw data from your data source, where possible, the Power Query engine will take all of the steps you defined in your query, all of the different transformations, and push them back to the data source. So for example, if you're connecting to a relational database like SQL Server, and you're grabbing some data from a table and then removing some columns and filtering some rows, then when you're connecting to SQL Server, instead of connecting just to that table, bringing it all into the Power Query engine and doing those transformations in the Power Query engine, something that would be very inefficient, especially if you've got a large amount of data, query folding means that the Power Query engine will try to take those steps, the selecting the columns, the filtering the rows, and push them back to the data source. So let's see an example of this. So I've got a query here. This connects to my local SQL Server, the AdventureWorks database, and it's getting data from the dim date table. Here's the source, here's the navigation step. This is all of the data in the dim date table at this point. But you can see what I've done here is I've got a removed other column step to remove the columns I don't want, filter the ones I do. And I've got a filtered row step here that says filter, so we only get the day name of week that's Friday. Now, at the moment, if we have a look at the data privacy settings for this with edit permissions, the privacy level for this data source is set to public. That's going to be good for my demos later. When I right click on this filtered row step, I've got an option called View Native Query. And this will show me the SQL that is generated when this query runs. And if you can read SQL, you can see that I'm just selecting the columns that I want, and I've got a where clause where I'm filtering the rows just down to Friday. So this is query folding in action. This still doesn't explain how data can be sent from one data source to another, though. So we need to go into a little bit more detail to understand options here. Let me restart my slides to show. So let's consider the following scenario. Let's say you've got some data in Excel and you've got some data in a table, and there is a column called day there. So here's my table. There's the column day, and in that column there's one row with the value Tuesday. Let's say that I've got a Power Query query in Power BI that gets that value Tuesday. So that's all it returns. Let's say we've also got the server database with a date table in, and we want to filter the days in that date table by the name of a day of the week. And we want that filter to take the value that we've got from Excel, Tuesday, and use that value to filter by day of the week. So when query folding takes place, you can imagine that what we're doing is we're getting the data from Excel, we're connecting to SQL Server, we're saying, give me everything from my date table, where day equals, and we're going to inject that value Tuesday we got from Excel into the SQL query we've generated and run that against SQL Server. So query folding's taken place, but what's just happened? We have taken data from Excel and we have passed it to SQL Server, because in order to build that where clause where day equals Tuesday, there's no other way that query folding can happen. So hopefully this illustrates how query folding can happen, because how data can travel from one data source to another, because when query folding takes place, it is highly likely that we've got to construct a where clause that looks like this. And this is where these data privacy checks are going to be applied. If we go back a little bit to my previous slide, privacy settings affect query folding. Now, we've got this concept of compatible and incompatible data sources. Remember I said that data from public data sources can flow to other public data sources? When data can flow from one data source to another, that means those two data sources are compatible. Remember also I said that data can't flow from private data sources to other private data sources. That means that if both data sources are private, they are incompatible. So the rules with data privacy and query folding are such that if you've got compatible data sources and data can flow from one source to another, then that's going to allow query folding to take place, as I just showed in that demo. And if it does, performance is going to be better. But if you've got incompatible data sources, you might have a problem. So two things could happen when you've got incompatible data sources. You could have a situation where the query still runs, but things are slow. Or you've got a situation where you get an error, perhaps. So let's look at the demo that I just did and consider what might happen when you've got incompatible data sources and where query folding doesn't take place. So remember, we're getting data from our Excel spreadsheet, we're getting the name of the day of the week, and we want to use that as a filter on our date table. If query folding is not allowed to take place by our data privacy settings, another way that the Power Query engine can work is to say, let's get that date, that day name Tuesday. Let's go to SQL Server. Let's grab all of the data from the date table, and then let's apply the filtering on day name in the Power Query engine instead. So in that situation, query folding doesn't take place, but the query can still run. So data privacy can stop query folding taking place, and that might also in turn then mean that you get a performance hit. Let's see an example of this. So we've seen how we've got a kind of hard-coded query here where I'm filtering my date table by Friday. Here, I've got something else. So I've got a query here called day name value. And if we just have a look at the M code, there's not much interesting going on here, but I'm getting the name of a day of the week from an Excel file that I've got stored locally. The code isn't all that interesting, but it connects to an Excel file, gets the name of a day, and there returns the text Monday. And then here in my query, this is identical to the query I just showed you before, but instead of filtering on a hard-coded name, it's filtering on that name of the day of the week that is being returned by the day name value query. Hence, we only get the values for Monday. Now, if we have a look at the data source settings for SQL Server, that's privacy level is set to public. If we have a look at the Excel file that I'm connecting to, that is also set to public. We make sure this is refreshed because it's always good to refresh the preview here. If I right click on View Native Query, you can see that query folding has taken place. That name Monday is embedded in the query. Query folding is taking place. The query is likely to be fast, but we're sending the data from Excel to SQL Server, where perhaps a DBA might be able to see that value. If, on the other hand, I change the data privacy level for my Excel file to private, and private then means that these data sources are incompatible because one's private and one's public. And remember, I can't send data from a private data source to anywhere else. I click OK, and I click refresh. The query still runs, but if I right click on here, you'll see that View Native Query has been grayed out because we're no longer generating a SQL query that gets only the rows for Monday. In the background, we're generating a SQL query that gets the rows in the table, and then we're applying that filter on Monday inside the Power Query engine. So we're getting a larger amount of data from the data source, and we're doing the filtering in the Power Query engine where the filter is going to be a lot less efficient than if it had happened in SQL Server instead. So incompatible data sources can sometimes cause performance problems, but the query still runs, so we're okay. So what about a situation where something worse happens, where we might get errors? This is where we're going to have a look at the first of those error messages that I talked about. So if we go back to my PowerPoint, there's another possible scenario here. In some cases, if you're not allowed to send data from one data source to another because of the privacy levels, you might get an error. For example, consider this situation. We've got our same Excel file, and we want to get the value Tuesday, but instead of passing that and using that as a filter in a SQL Server database, let's imagine that we've got a web service that we want to call. So perhaps we want to pass the value Tuesday to a web service and get some interesting data back. If the data privacy level for my Excel file is set to public, then yes, I am absolutely allowed to take that Tuesday, pass it in as a query parameter to my web service, and send it over to my web service and get some useful data back. But if I'm not allowed to take that data from Excel and pass it to a web service, because it's private data, because I'm not allowed to pass it to another data source, this is the error message that I'm going to get. So this is the first of the Formula Firewall error messages, and you'll see that it's telling me that I can't, that this query in this particular step is accessing data sources that have privacy levels which cannot be used together. This error message is saying you can't send data from this data source to another one. Let's see this in action. So here is my call web service data source. Now, if we go to data source settings and make sure that my Excel data source, if we go to edit permissions, is set to public again, this means that data from Excel can go somewhere else. Here you can see that I'm getting data from Excel, and then I am constructing a URL for the web service and passing the name of the day of the week into the URL as a query parameter. When I do this and refresh the preview, it will just work. If, however, I go to data source settings and go to selected day, edit permissions, and set this to private and refresh, bingo, we get the error message. So this is the first of the error messages. This is perhaps the easiest one to understand because so long as you set your data source privacy levels so that they are compatible, then the error message will go away. You could, of course, get around this by turning off data privacy checks completely, but like I said, you don't want to do that because if you turn off data privacy checks completely, you are potentially going to be sending data from your private data sources to anywhere else and possibly breaking the law, causing data leaks, causing terrible headlines, and doing yourself a great disservice. Let's move on. It's time to talk about the second of the error messages that I showed you. This is where things get even more complicated, and this is where we're reaching the level of my knowledge. This is where new things are happening and new bits of functionality are being added to Power Query. So when data sources are evaluated, what the Power Query engine does in the background is it looks at the queries you're running and it groups the steps in queries together into something called partitions. So partitions are a key thing when it comes to enforcing data privacy rules. So partitions are not obvious when you look at a query, but partitions can now be viewed with a bit of functionality that was only released within the last couple of weeks. There is a new option in query diagnostics that allows you to see the partitions inside a query when it executes. So if I go to Power BI Desktop again, and we are looking at our query here, let's make sure that the data privacy settings are set appropriately. So we've got that to public. This is, I have to admit, a little bit, sorry, I need to set this to both to private. There are still one or two bugs or interesting pieces of behavior with this, even though it's been released. So considering our query here that we were just looking at, which takes data from two different data sources, if I was to right click on this filtered row step and click diagnose so that I can see what's happening and get my query diagnostics data. Oh, and also I need to go to tools and diagnostic options and make sure this data privacy partitions option is checked. What I'm going to get when that step is diagnosed is a diagnostics query like the one I've got here, which has got partitions in the name. And this will show me all of the partitions inside that particular query. So in that query called dim date query folding, there are 3 partitions that have been found. The names of these partitions are assigned by the name of the step, which is the last step in the partition. So we've got 3 partitions here called day name, value, day name. So basically, if we look at this query references the day name value query, and the day name step in the day name value query is the last step here. So that's going to be the first partition. We've also got a step here called removed other columns in the dim date query folding query. It's that step here. So these 3 steps are involved in a partition. And then finally, we've got a partition called filtered rows, which is this sole step here. So this query has been split up into 3 different partitions. Now, when you've got the partitions identified, these partitions are used to control how data flows from one place to another. Because when data flows from one partition to another, 3 things can happen. Data can be allowed to flow through it freely. Data from one partition could be buffered in memory and then passed on, or data can be stopped from flowing. Now, if data is stopped from flowing, you're going to see an error. If data is buffered when it goes from one partition to another, you'll see the situation we had earlier where query folding didn't happen when we were going from Excel to SQL Server because of the data privacy set to private. And if data is allowed to flow, we'll see what happened in the first demo that I did where query folding is allowed to happen. Now, the rule about whether data is going to be whether these data privacy checks at the partition level are going to be allowed to work is this. If you've got a partition, a set of steps inside a query, each partition can either access compatible data sources, so data sources which are all public, for example. It can reference other partitions, but it can't do both. Now, those are the conditions that have to be the case for data privacy to be applied. And there are situations where you break these rules that you will see the second of our errors, which is the query step references other queries or steps, so it may not directly access a data source. Please rebuild this combination. So what does this mean? This is the hardest of the errors to deal with, unfortunately. So let's see an example of this. So I've got a query I've written here which specifically gives me this error. Now this error is not happening because I've got incompatible data sources. This query is this second error is happening because the Power Query engine is unable to even apply or check its own data privacy rules. So I've written some M code here in a way that confuses the engine, that stops it knowing whether data is going to be set from one data source to another. And what I've done here is I've taken that demo that I did before and I've collapsed it all into a single step. So what I've got here is a single step that at the same time connects to SQL Server and filters using table.select rows, all in a single step called filtered rows. And this then breaks the rule of connecting to a data source, which is what I'm doing here, and accessing another partition, which is what I'm doing here. And when the Power Query engine doesn't know whether data is going to be sent from one data source to another, that's when you see this second error about referencing other queries or steps. And the only thing you can do here to get around this is to actually rewrite your query. Now, there are a number of different ways that you can do this. It's not really documented anywhere. I'm always finding new ways of doing this. But if we take this particular query and rewrite it, for example, to split things up into separate steps, as we've had before, it all works. Because I've got one partition here now that accesses data, and I've got a second partition here that accesses another partition, which is day name value. So the rules are allowed to be applied, everything works, the query runs. In other situations, you might have other problems. And there are other workarounds for this. I'll show you some other scenarios that you might run into. I've got a query here that connects to another Excel file and returns the path of a text file. I've got a query here where I am trying to take that path that I've got from my file name query here, passing it into excel.workbook to get the contents of that file. But again, what's happening here? This is a step that accesses a data source, an Excel workbook, and accesses data coming from another data source or another partition, which is the query that gets the name of the file that I want to access. So we get the error here. It turns out that rather than having a query that returns this text, if we make this a function, now it's a function with no parameters, but I've just changed it into a function here. For whatever reason, this then works. All right, but I've got incompatible privacy levels. So if I change my data source settings to be public, there we go, it works. So just by changing this query from a regular query into an M function, so all I've done is just added this extra line of code here. That's enough to work around the error. The other common scenario where you'll run into this is where you're trying to generate, for example, dynamic SQL. Let's have a look at this query here. I'm connecting to SQL Server, but I'm actually specifying a query to run rather than letting Power Query generate the SQL, and I am dynamically generating the SQL here. So this is a single step, again, that connects to SQL Server and also wants to get data from another partition, which is this. If I edit the permission, I get the error that I'm expecting. I can work around this in a couple of different ways, though. Rather than using dynamic SQL, all right, sometimes these errors do really wind me up because they don't happen consistently. What should happen by putting everything all together in a single query like this means that all of these steps are considered part of the same partition, because partitions are usually munged together. You can't have a partition that crosses query boundaries. So by putting all of the steps from all of your queries into one big query, that's usually enough to make this go away. There are some bugs still around here, which is why, oh no, I've got the privacy levels issue here. All right, let's get rid of the privacy. So that's set to public and edit permissions public. Edit permissions public. There we go. There's my query running. And this runs because I've combined all of these steps together into one big query rather than having all of this as a separate query. So that's one way of working around it. And then there is another option here where instead of using SQL.database to run the query, there is another function called value.native query. And value.native query gives you something that SQL.database doesn't give you, which is the ability to use parameterized queries. So here I've got a query parameter called @filter parameter, and the value I'm passing into that is the value from returned by dayname value here. And that is enough to tell the Power Query engine that actually you're not technically passing data from one data source to another or creating a dynamic data source. And that's enough to make the query run. So this can be massively confusing, but bear in mind that you've got these partitions, you're not allowed to access data from another partition and data directly from a data source in the same step. So you either reduce the number of partitions, make sure you're getting data from the same partition rather than from a different partition, or instead you use a query that doesn't dynamically generate a query. use a Power Query query that doesn't dynamically generate any SQL or any other query language. So yes, all very, very complex, difficult stuff, but all doable. Another thing to mention, and this is important, is that data privacy checks can actually impact performance. So we've seen, or I've mentioned already, that one of the side effects of data privacy checks is that even when the query is allowed to run, there could be situations where instead of query folding happening, query folding is stopped, and the Power Query engine has to get more data than it needs from a data source and apply filtering internally. There are going to be other situations where data needs to be buffered in memory before this happens as well. So this all means that data privacy checks can have sometimes quite a noticeable impact on overall query performance. So if you're ever sitting inside Power BI Desktop and looking at your queries running, and you've got a very long, you see the dialog box with the spinny box, the spinny showing, and it's telling you that the query is evaluating, that's typically as a result of having very slow data privacy. Your query being slow as a result of data privacy checks. So you can actually speed things up either by making your data sources compatible or turning off data privacy checks completely. But like I said, if you do that, you've got to be very, very careful indeed. The next thing to mention about data privacy checks are that everything we've done so far has been in Power BI Desktop. The data privacy settings you set on the dialog that I've shown you already in the Power Query editor are not retained after you publish to the service. After you publish your data set to the service, you need to set your data privacy options separately. Now, there are two places you do this. If you've got a data source that you can connect to without going through an on-premises gateway, like this one here, if you click, or if you go to data source credentials in the settings for your data set, click edit credential, you can set the data privacy level for your data source here. If you're going through an on-premises gateway, you've got to go into the gateway, find your data source as it's defined there, and then you've got the option to set the data privacy level on the data source in the gateway. So again, it could be the case that you've got your data privacy levels set so that they are compatible in Power BI Desktop. You test everything in Power BI Desktop, the data privacy checks are applied and everything works. But after you publish to the service, it could be that somebody sets the data privacy levels separately or differently there, and that could be why you've got your refresh failing and you're getting errors about data privacy in the service only. So that's something to watch out for. It's also worth mentioning that you can't turn off data privacy checks for data sets in the Power BI service, with some exceptions. If all of your data sources come from a personal gateway, so not an on-premises gateway in regular mode, but an on-premises gateway in personal mode, there is an option on a personal gateway to turn off data privacy checks. But that would then turn off data privacy checks for absolutely everything, and I would say that that's all equally dangerous. So you've got to assume basically that your data privacy checks will be applied when you publish up to the service. So therefore, there's no point really turning off data privacy checks in Power BI Desktop. There are some other things to mention as well. Another way of kind of working around data privacy checks are to create custom connectors. So you may be aware that in Power Query, you can create your own data source connectors by writing M code using the Power Query SDK. This is fairly complicated. You need to be very good at M to be able to do it. But one of the interesting things about custom connectors is that when you write M code within a custom connector, data privacy checks are not applied. So if you did want a way of working around data privacy settings in the Power BI service and you wanted to maybe make things fast as well, and you are sure that you're not sending data from one data source to another, you could put some code in a custom connector, and that would allow you to work around it. The problem with custom connectors, though, is, of course, you can only use them with going via an on-premises gateway. So they're not ideal. Maybe a better option instead is to use dataflows, because dataflows allow you to work around data privacy checks in not one but two ways. Let's see what I mean by this. If we go back to my browser up here, the first thing to say is that, well, the easy way of working around data privacy checks within dataflows is just to go to options, project options, and even though data privacy checks are turned on by default, you can turn off data privacy checks for a data flow just by unchecking this box here in project options. So if you've got some queries and you can't get around either of these two error messages that I've shown you so that you can publish, one option would be to publish this data up, these queries up as data flows rather than queries inside your data set. Turn off this option here and everything will just work. Again, the usual warnings apply. Make sure you are not sending sensitive data somewhere it shouldn't be sent. But that's one way of doing things. Another thing to point out is that if you've got Power BI Premium, you've got an option of creating something called a computed entity. So in Power BI Desktop, you can reference queries and have queries that get data from the output of other queries. Computed entities in Power BI Premium are similar, except that with a computed entity, even though, and we've got an option, an example here, we've got a computed entity that gets data from my dim date query here. When you've got a computed entity in Premium, what happens with this is that rather than when this query running, these queries running and sending their data directly to the computed entity, in Premium data flows, these two queries will run, their output will be saved into some managed Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage, and this computed entity gets its data from the staged tables held in Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. So in this situation, even if we have data privacy checks turned on, even though the code looks identical to what we had in the desktop, we're never ever going to be going back to the original data sources. We are going to be getting the staged data that's stored in Azure Data Lake Gen 2 storage. And again, data can't go from one data source to another because this is all text. These are all text files. Data are all living inside Power BI. So this is another way of maybe working around the issues. Okay. That brings me to the end of the presentation. In summary, data privacy is very, very, very complex indeed. And it can be very frustrating when you see one of those two errors. But remember, when you see the error about incompatible data sources, this is your prompt to go away and have a look at the data privacy levels set for each data source and set them to make sure they are compatible and feel happy that you're okay, that query folding might happen as a result and data could be sent from one data source to another. If you see the error message about the second error message that I showed about please rebuild that combination, this is where you've got to start thinking to rewrite your queries to make sure that a single partition doesn't access a data source and get data from another partition at the same time. And as I said, if you're still confused and frustrated by that, probably the easiest option to make all this work when you in the Power BI service is to use data flows and just turn off data privacy checks there. But I'm going to say this one more time, and it's even more important now that I work for Microsoft. You really need to understand how data privacy settings work, because if you don't, you are in danger of sending private data from one data source to another where it will be seen by people who shouldn't be allowed to see it, and You could lose your job, your company could get sued, you could find yourself on maybe not the front page of the newspapers, but perhaps being discussed in the register and be a general embarrassment to yourself. So this is something that you really need to understand. It is important. It is frustrating, but it's not going to change. And it's the way it is for a very good reason. So that's the end. If anybody's got any questions, now is the time to ask them.
I've got one from Wellington, Chris.
Sure.
Sorry, Jeff here. Phil's fellow Power BI user group runner in Wellington here. Ken Paul showed me once that if you turn off privacy when doing using M in Excel, it can radically speed things up.
Yes.
In Excel, I mean, this wasn't a query that I was just using just to get some data from. I think it was from within the same workbook, or it might have been another workbook, but it wasn't going anywhere. In Excel, is privacy? Can you tell us anything interesting about privacy in Excel that would? Sorry,
the answer
late,
is yeah. So the answer is no. I can't tell you anything particular about either the way the Power Query engine works in Excel, because as far as I understand it, it should work in the same way as it does in Power BI, although there are some interesting behaviors around this. And as you probably know, the version of the Power Query engine in Power BI Desktop is a little bit in advance of what's even in the latest versions of Excel 365. So there could be some subtle changes in behavior and bugs that get fixed. But in general, data privacy should work in the same way in Excel. There's another part to this question of data privacy where you're in Excel and you're getting data from Excel. There are no particular differences there either. But absolutely, it's the case that turning off data privacy checks can massively speed up performance. And if you're only ever getting data from the same Excel workbook, then there's no danger that data is going to go from one place to another. So in Excel, you can have that in that situation, at least in Excel, you can have confidence in turning off data privacy checks, because you're not going to do any harm. And yeah, it can really, really speed things up.
It took it from, I don't know, half an hour down to seconds. It was really staggering. Yes,
and I've seen situations like that as well.
And one other quick one. I see on the documentation for dataflows that it says dynamic functions are currently not supported within dataflows. Is that related to what we've been talking about somehow?
Possibly. I think it might be referring to dynamic data sources, but I don't know about that in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hi, Chris. It was a really good session. Thank you. I just have two short questions. About a year ago, when there was a project we were working on and had similar errors, and then we were connected with Microsoft in support, and they said that the on-premises gateway defaults to private, and then they recommended us to use the personal one because there was no other way to go around this error in the service. There was no error in the desktop. Are you aware of this problem, or is it solved that now now the on-premises gateway respects the privacy level settings?
That sounds like it might have been a bug. I'm not aware of that particular issue. It might be there's some confusion there, because the on-prem gateway has never defaulted to private. You've always been able to specifically set, or maybe you haven't actually. No, maybe I tell a lie. A couple of years ago, I don't think you could set the data privacy options in the gateway, could you?
I think it said that it doesn't matter what you set to it. It defaulted to private. So I mean, in the settings
that
it shows
sounds like
it's organizational, but it just treated as private about a year ago.
Yeah, so that sounds like it was a bug, to be honest.
Yeah, the other thing is in a large organization when there are thousands of data sets, obviously individuals to know which is private, which is organizational is really hard, and to expect them to really know. Do you know anything that data catalog might be able to, to pick up those privacy settings or privacy details when you connect to data sources that are in a data catalog, and then it will automatically set Power Query? What is the
That
privacy
would
thing?
be
So you
nice,
don't know.
wouldn't it?
Yeah.
No, but I don't know anything at all about that.
Thank you very much.
But ideally, yes, some kind of data catalog would be able to understand this. So we'll have to see. I don't know, to be honest.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Chris. Mike Smith here. I have a question for you. Where I run into the second error that you demoed is often when I'm merging queries together. And I've read Ken Pohl's blog post probably 50 times about staging query, which seems to solve the problem when I have two data sources. But when I have a query that brings in 3 or more data sources, I kind of throw my hands in the air. I just don't know how to handle that.
Yeah. If I'm honest, Ken wrote that blog post at a time when nobody really understood how this works. There is no real official documentation on this, but since Ken wrote that blog post, there is and let me find the link for you. There is another why is my Google failing me? There was a more detailed explanation of why this is happening with the partitions that turned up in the Power Query forum. So let me see if I can find it today. I will find here we go. Maybe not. All right, I will need to find the link for you and put it in the chat. But there is a really good detailed explanation about here it is, about how the partitioning actually works on the Power Query forum. You can read it here. The problem with this when it was published is that there was no way of finding out where the partitions were made in your own query. And that's what the new query diagnostics option for partitions actually gives you. And so it's only really been for the last couple of weeks we've been able to see where the partitions are applied. So any blog posts that are written before this link that appeared that I put in the chat last year are really people just guessing about what's going on. And it's certainly possible that by staging your data, you change how the partitions work and everything works. In general, I've found that rather than having a staging query, putting all of your data, all of your steps into one big query is a more reliable way of making things go away. But that was really, an equally trial and error approach to solving this problem. So the best option really nowadays, and this is something that I need to do some more work on understanding, and I'll be blogging about in the near future, is to instead understand this paper and use the query diagnostics option to see where your partitions are and try and understand what's going on and why you might be getting the error.
Gotcha.
We're not quite there yet, but I would say in 6 months or a year, the functionality will be there, the information needed will be in the public domain, and people like me and Ken will be able to blog about this with some confidence rather than just saying, here's some random error I don't understand, and I did this and it went away. And I'm not being down on Ken because I was in exactly the same situation. None of us knew about this until Aaron from the dev team actually wrote this paper to explain why all this stuff was going on.
Sure. Thank you.
Any more questions? Cool. So I will be giving Prathi my slides. The recording will be made available, and like I said, when I really understand how the new query diagnostics functionality works, and I'll whisper it when certain bugs have been ironed out from it as well, I will be blogging and explaining some of the things that I've tried to explain in this presentation in more detail.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Chris. Hugely insightful presentation as always. And thanks everybody else for joining. If you could just spend a few minutes providing feedback on the link on the screen, Prathi and I hugely appreciate that. We will be back in a couple of weeks. I think next time we have Peter Myers lined up. Keep an eye out on meetup.com for the details for our next session. We'll be posting that shortly. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks everybody for joining.
Cool. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thank you, Chris.
It's my pleasure.